Okay, right. I'm going to get started. So, for everybody who's joined us today, we are recording. So, if you are joining a little bit later in the day, or if you want to watch the session back, then you're more than welcome to do so. But for now, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining. So, welcome to our session on Start the Conversation with Inclusive Change. My name is Becca. I am Support Operations Specialist here at Inclusive Change. I have lived experience of ADHD and autistic traits. Today, I'm going to be giving you a short practical introduction to neurodiversity and support in the workplace. After the session, we will be doing a 15-minute question and answer session, Q&A. So if you would like to stick around for that, you are more than welcome to do so. If you have any questions, you're welcome to pop them in the chat as we go, but I will be sticking to time and then picking them up after the session if that's okay with everybody. Okay, so who are we at Inclusive Change? So you're probably thinking, who is this smiley blonde lady sat talking to us about neurodiversity today? So Inclusive Change, we are a neurodiversity-led organisation, and we build the future of work with neurodiversity in mind. So part of our services are that we offer training around neurodiversity in the workplace. We offer policy development and direct support. So we support both organisations and individuals with neurodiversity training and policy practice. We also have a sister company called Inclusive Change at Work, CIC. That is a community interest-based company, and that's more around offering support for career coaching and people who are neurodivergent to get work experience, namely our Project Sandbox that we currently have going on at the moment. If you would like to find out more, our websites are both on the slides here. So what to expect in today's session. Here is a very brief rundown of what we're going to get through. We've only got 30 minutes, so it is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour in terms of the more information-heavy slides, but we're going to do a very simple breakdown of what neurodiversity is, how neurodiversity can show up in the workplace, and the specific strengths and barriers that come along with that, reasonable adjustments for neurodiversity in the workplace and how to ask for them as a neurodivergent person, and access to work, which hopefully we will get around to if we have time. But we won't be able to cover everything in a huge amount of detail, but hopefully we'll leave you knowing where to start and where to come back for more. So a few ground rules. Now, neurodiversity is a big topic, and I believe there's about 60 plus years of research behind it in each respective field. So what I would say is that we won't have time to go into everything today because there's a very broad range of neurotypes we could dive into. I'm primarily going to be focusing on ADHD, being autistic, dyslexia, and dyspraxia for today's session. This is a space where everyone should feel safe and respected when exploring these topics, okay? So be curious and ask questions. You are welcome to say, actually, I didn't understand that bit, and we won't judge you for it. It's completely okay to say the wrong thing because we're not here to tell people off. We're here for everybody to listen and learn to each other. If you need to seek clarification, you're welcome to put a message in the chat or drop us an email afterwards, particularly around the language we use, if that's a barrier. So, participation guidelines. This session is going to run for 30 minutes with a 15-minute Q&A session afterwards, if you're not constrained by time and you would like to stay on. Feel free to fidget, eat, drink your lunch, eat or drink, move around, doodle or stim if you need to. It's okay to be quiet, but we do love interaction. So if you have questions, we are going to be primarily using the chat today. Carly is keeping an eye on it. So if anybody has any questions, she can pop them in the chat for you. Cameras on or off, but please can I ask that everybody stays muted throughout the session, just in the interest of time. And if you have got a pressing question, pop it in the chat and we can come back to it later. So here's the big question. What is neurodiversity? Well, biologically, everybody's brain works slightly differently. Most people sit within what we call a typical norm, but then again, what is typical? But then lots of people sit outside of it. So you might recognize terms on this chart like being autistic, dyspraxia, dyslexia, ADHD, CPTSD is possibly a lesser known one. If you want the full training, we do offer a Start the Conversation that's about an hour long, but we probably won't have time to go into it today. Put very simply, neurodiversity describes a group of people whose brains are physiologically different from neurotypical brains. That's the very broad overview. So physiologically different. Think of an Android operating system versus an iOS operating system on a phone. Same brains, but different ways of working. So I'm just going to run through very briefly some words that you might know or recognize about neurodiversity. So neurodivergent is a word for somebody who, so you would refer to yourself as a neurodivergent person if you are just one person in a group of people. ADHDer, that's how I talk about myself. So I have lived experience of being an ADHDer with autistic traits. Autistic, both of these are really good examples of what we call identity first language. So rather than saying, I am someone with ADHD, you center your identity around it and say, I'm an ADHDer or I'm autistic. Neurospicy, that is probably one that is more relevant to perhaps like social media, Gen Z. It's really popular among Gen Z. ADHD is a very new term. That is a term that describes somebody who's autistic and ADHD. So I could be described as someone who is an ADHDer, or we call it the gold standard in my coaching practice because of the AU. Neurodivergence literally refers to somebody whose brain is diverging from the typical. So that is a very simple overview of that. And then we've put dis something because there's quite a few different definitions. I've struggled to get that out then. So dyscalculia is one that I have lived experience of. Dyslexia is probably the one that most people have heard of. Dyscalculia is essentially dyslexia with numbers. So dyslexia is when people struggle with reading and words. Dyscalculia is numbers. And then dyspraxia is when you struggle with hand-eye coordination, bumping into things, that kind of stuff. And then neurotypical. I'm not convinced that everybody is neurotypical, actually. I think we're going to get to a point where we realize that actually everybody's brain is slightly different, and that's okay. But that is on there just to demonstrate that you've probably heard it before. So we have a very broad slide here of some famous people. If you recognize any names, feel free to pop them in the chat. But from top left to the right, we have Holly Smell, who's the author of Geek Girl. She is autistic. will.i.am is, I believe, diagnosed ADHD. Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer, he is also ADHD. And then Chris Packham, so I believe he's on Springwatch. He's autistic. Greta Thunberg, very prominent climate activist. She is autistic. And then we've got Chris Thompson. So if we're going down from the sort of second row left to right, we've got Chris Thompson, who is autistic and ADHD. You might recognise him from I'm a Celebrity, but he was also on, I believe, Made in Chelsea. I'll need somebody who knows reality TV to knock that in for me. Lucy Bronze, so she was on the women's football team for the World Cup finals a few years ago. She's ADHD, so she's autistic and ADHD. Daisy May Cooper, you might recognise her as the BAFTA award-winning writer of this country. She's also a presenter on Nevermind the Buzzcocks. She is ADHD, so she has an ADHD diagnosis. Simone Biles, obviously, Olympic American gymnast. She has been quite open about her ADHD diagnosis. Richard Branson, so he was originally diagnosed as dyslexic when he was younger, but in adult life was diagnosed with ADHD as well. So he's got the combined two. And then there is from the bottom left to the right, just double checking my placement there, we've got Ajua Ando, who is, you might recognise her from Bridgerton. She is dyspraxic, so she has dyspraxia. We have Jamie Oliver, who is dyslexic. Keira Knightley, also dyslexic. And then we've got Shaparat Khorsandi, previously known as Shappy Khorsandi. So she is ADHD. And then we also have, last but not least, childhood favourite of mine, Daniel Radcliffe. So he has a diagnosis of dyspraxia. So the purpose of this slide is to show you all that neurodiversity doesn't have a look. Everybody on this page, you wouldn't look at them and necessarily think they have a disability or a hidden disability, but everybody is different and everyone's brain is different. So neurodiversity doesn't have a set look. And actually, it's really lovely to have role models like this that we can look up to as well who are famous. So we've had a little bit of fun and, a bit of a light-hearted touch looking at famous people who are neurodivergent. So I am going to share some slightly sobering statistics with you now. I say sobering because they can be a little bit sad, but the good news is the reason we do this training is to raise awareness around it, okay? So the most crucial one, I would argue, is that around 20% of the UK population is neurodivergent, yet most workplaces aren't designed for them. 80% of neurodivergent employees don't disclose at work due to stigma. 30 to 40% of neurodivergent employees struggle with retention due to lack of support. Again, that's a really important one. And 53% of Gen Z identify as neurodivergent, aka our future workforce coming up through the ranks. They are going to be looking for that same level of support they're getting at school. So some important things to share there. I do want to move over to sharing some strengths that neurodivergent people bring to the workforce, though. So I'm going to list them here. We won't have time to go through them all, but from a personal perspective as an ADHDer, I have lived experience of essentially being incredibly empathetic towards people. Like my neurodivergence means that I can move into the line of work that I have or have been able to, and I've been able to support people and essentially think of really creative ways to help with any problems that are presented to me throughout my working life. So there's a few on there that some of you might resonate with. Pop it in the chat if that is the case. Strong sense of social justice, there it is. That's something else that we can bring to the workforce for greater good. Now, some of the challenges that we might experience. So again, we won't have time to go into all of them in detail, but here are just a few that we struggle with. Now, I'm going to immediately point to numeracy. As somebody with a lived experience of dyscalculia, I really struggle with things like just basic maths, mental arithmetic, money, managing money, anything to do with any kind of like dealing with numbers that you could possibly think of. That would be a barrier that I personally experience. Starting tasks can also be a barrier as well. So actually getting started on a task, I need physical prompts or written instructions or for tasks to be broken down. So there's just a few there. Barriers that can become apparent at work. So I would say that the 4 key things that we see are executive function, sensory challenges, communication differences, and anxiety. They're probably the 4 most prominent ones. So what is executive function? Executive function is a term that gets used a lot, but not really explained very clearly. It's the name for a set of mental skills that helps us manage our time, focus our attention, control our emotions, and carry out multi-step tasks, which are all things that people who are neurodivergent quite openly struggle with. ADHDers in the audience might recognise the concentration and focus. We don't necessarily struggle with focus, we struggle with controlling our focus. That would be the thing I would say about that one. We also experience sensory challenges. So to give you an example, I don't know if anybody here is very active on social media, but it's basically neurodivergent people experience sensory challenges differently. So this can mean being quite hypersensitive, where sounds, lights, or touch or feel can become overwhelming, or hyposensitive. So when something may not register certain stimuli until it's incredibly strong. So that can be quite overwhelming for people as well. In a typical office environment, that could translate to fluorescent lights being really overwhelming for somebody, or somebody eating their lunch in the office. Like that could be something that sets us off as well. So we are going to very, very briefly touch on the social model of disability, because for the last part of this presentation, we're going to be looking at reasonable adjustments, what they are, how you can request them, and essentially what qualifies as a reasonable adjustment as well. And we look at the social model of disability for this. Very, very, very simply, the social model of disability focuses on the fact that society creates barriers. It doesn't matter what your disability is. It's if our environment, attitudes, or policies block people, that's the problem that we fix. I use problem in very loose terms, but we do that by examining a business's environment, attitudes, and organizational structure. It's not about giving everyone special treatment over the other. It's about removing barriers to give access to everybody, essentially. So we are going to focus very briefly on the legislation around this, because the key thing to highlight here is that we are not legal experts, okay? But we will highlight key points of UK law that could help you. The big one is the Equality Act 2010. Now, what is the Equality Act? There are 9 protected characteristics in the Equality Act. Disability is the one we're going to be focusing on for this particular section of the presentation. In the Equality Act, a disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So that is a very important definition that we tend to focus on and highlight for our training. The other part of the Equality Act is Section 20. I'm just going to bear with me a sec. So Section 20 of the legislation is also very important. And I will say there is a bit of a stick and a carrot issue when it comes to supporting neurodivergent people in the workplace, as we've seen from the statistics earlier on in the slide. The guidance that we focus on are these two definitions. So section 20, this says that the employers have a duty to make reasonable adjustments to make sure that disabled people are not substantially disadvantaged compared to those who are not disabled. Now, this duty applies to both workers and job applicants, and that's the important bit we'll focus on later. A key thing to highlight through both of these definitions is that A, we could be here for hours picking apart exactly what those things mean. You know, what does substantially disadvantaged mean? The other thing to highlight is that nowhere in those definitions does it mention that a disabled person or somebody who has a disability needs a diagnosis to be able to access support. So those are the things that I'd like to leave with you both. We haven't got a huge amount of time to delve into it, but if you have got any questions off the back of the training, please do let me know and I'd be happy to go through it with you. So what is reasonable? You're probably thinking, what does reasonable actually mean? Well, reasonable to one person might not be reasonable to somebody else. And unfortunately, spoiler alert, there's no single definition. Okay, it depends on the context and a few key factors. Will the adjustment actually remove the disadvantage? What about health and safety? The Health and Safety Act will always trump the Equality Act 2010. Is it practicable to make that adjustment? What's the cost? And what are the organisation's resources? And would it cause any disruption to the business or the wider team? That's how we weigh up what's reasonable, essentially. And if it goes beyond what's reasonable for an employer, that's where access to work can come in and help. So what actually helps? You're probably thinking, well, this is all very well and good, Becca, but what actual examples can you give us that we could focus on, or what could be relevant sort of nuggets of wisdom to take away? And that's what the last part of the training is going to be. So let's talk about what reasonable adjustments can look like in practice, particularly in the context of job interviews. Now, for many neurodivergent candidates, the interview setting itself can itself be a barrier. Not because they're not capable of doing the job, but because traditional interview formats often rely heavily on fast processing, social cues, and working memory. None of those are reliable measures of someone's ability to thrive in a role. So one of the things you can do is ask for interview questions in advance. It gives you the time to process, reflect, and prepare meaningful answers, rather than having to think on the spot, which as an ADHDer, I personally really struggle with, and this has tripped me up before. Extra processing time. So that might look like taking a pause before answering, or being reassured that it's okay to take a moment to think by the interviewer. Some candidates might also benefit from slightly longer interviews or time in between questions to give them a chance to answer properly. Clear, direct questions. Avoiding overly open or abstract questions like, tell me about yourself, which could really limit somebody who's autistic in terms of answering a question. Instead, try breaking questions into smaller parts or asking for specific examples. This makes it easier to give structured, relevant responses. That would be my recommendation. I worked in recruitment for 3 years. I probably should have prefaced this presentation with that. So I have a little bit of experience of that. Clear written or visual instructions for the process. What is the interview process going to look like? What is your recruitment standard practice? What do how long do I have to wait from a job application to be submitted before I expect to hear a response? Alternative formats. So this could mean offering a remote interview, giving the option to respond to questions in writing rather than verbally if you are someone who goes non-verbal, or allowing pre-recorded video responses. The goal here is to remove barriers, not to lower standards, right? So thinking of alternative ways to help could be good. And finally, the use of prompts or notes. So being able to bring a copy of your CV, bullet point notes, or even a checklist of your key points to help manage that memory that, we unfortunately tend to struggle with sometimes. So reasonable adjustments in the workplace, they might look different to everybody, but the key here is that everybody is different, right? We mentioned earlier that one neurodivergent person's brain could be completely different to somebody else's. Therefore, they have completely different reasonable adjustment needs to, say, the person sat next to them, even if they both have ADHD, for example. That's something that we see quite a lot here. But the examples show what's possible and often what's easy to implement with just a little bit of flexibility. So noise cancelling headphones in busy environments. You might have noticed I'm wearing a pair. These are incredibly helpful for people who are sensitive, to background noise or who struggle to focus in open plan offices. Use of a note taker in meetings, being able to use something like AI software to dictate what is being said, especially because verbal instructions are really tricky for us to process. Having something written that we can refer back to reduces that risk of us forgetting what we've said or forgetting something that somebody has said to us verbally, just removes that barrier for us. Extra time to process or respond. Again, being able to have breaks in between, long bouts of work. Something that I do is with my coaching, I promote the Pomodoro technique. So everybody that I work with gets a window to work to a particular time. They have a 2-minute break and then they come back and repeat that process again. Visual aids. So not everybody learns best through verbal instructions alone. So visual aids like flowcharts, diagrams, videos, or checklists can really help reinforce that learning. Time and attention aids, or focus tools, as they are so called on the slide. These can include timers. I have a tactile timer that I use. I don't know if you can see it, but having something that visibly shows you how much time is passing, again, that can be really helpful. A structured environment and task support. So this might include clear routines, templates for common tasks like repetitive emails, or planning or project planning tools. It can also mean regular check-ins with a manager to clarify priorities and break down tasks in a way that's manageable for you. Flexible working environments is another really key one. So allowing somebody to work from home, start earlier or later, or use quiet spaces when needed to help reduce sensory overwhelm. That can be a really game-changing thing for people in the workplace. So how to request reasonable adjustments. Be prepared and know what your needs are. This can often be a tricky one to identify, but actually being specific about what you need is really, really helpful. So is it a noisy environment that could be distracting for you? Difficulty switching tasks, needing extra time to process instructions? Think about what helps you thrive and gets in the way. When you do make the request, be as specific as you can. So instead of saying, I find meetings overwhelming, try, I find fast-paced meetings hard to follow. Could we agree that I can receive the agenda ahead of time and use a note taker so that I can stay focused? Then you're giving clear solutions. Decide how and what to disclose, because you are in control of what you share, and you do not need to disclose that you have a disability under the Equality Act, which technically is what in neurodiversity could be seen as. And you can say that you essentially have needs that need to be met without saying that in specific words, if that makes sense. So, for example, I have a processing difference, which means I need a bit more time to absorb verbal instructions if I'm given verbal instructions, or even better. So I have a processing difference, which means I need a bit more time to absorb instructions. Could you provide written instructions for me as well in order to help me manage that? Ask for an advocate to support you. This can be a really powerful one, especially if you aren't too sure what needs you have or what specific requirements would be really useful for you. If you're unsure about how to raise a topic, having somebody there who can advocate for you can often be really helpful, especially if you're someone who's nonverbal. Make your request verbally or in writing. So you can talk to your manager or HR informally at first, but if needed, you can follow up in writing to keep a clear record of the things that you've asked for. And trial adjustments and review as needed. If something's not working for you, review it and try something different. Our brains, especially ADHD brains, need novelty and they need newness in order to keep us interested and excited. So actually, trialing adjustments and reviewing them is a really helpful thing for us, because what might have worked one week won't work the next. And that's just how ADHD brains work. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Telling others. You establish how and when your neurodivergence is discussed. You do not need to disclose or have a formal diagnosis for support. And you are also not obliged to tell anyone about your neurodiversity if you don't want to. I'm very lucky. I'm in a job where I talk about neurodiversity day in, day out. I'm happy and comfortable mentioning that I'm an ADHDer, what strengths and challenges I have, because I want to be a role model for the community. But I also understand that hidden disability stigma and internalized ableism is something we all deal with, and autonomy is also something we hold dear to us. So be kind to yourself and don't let anybody pressure you to disclose if you're not ready or you don't want to. If you are able to, your employer will be able to make adjustments in line with the Equality Act 2010. So again, coming back to that definition of you're not at a substantial disadvantage compared to an employee with no disability, they'll be able to make accommodations for you in line with that. Financial support is available through Access to Work, which I'm going to cover in the next few slides. And finally, you are protected by the Equality Act. It's there to protect the employer and the employee. So you do have that protection there if you need it. Let's just make sure I press the right button. There we go. So Access to Work. Now, if you're neurodivergent and you're in paid work or about to start a new job, you may be entitled to funding through a government scheme called Access to Work. If anybody's heard of it, please do pop it in the chat. But if not, I will go into it now. So what on earth is Access to Work? Now, it is a grant, so it's not something that needs to be paid back. It's a grant designed to fund the extra support somebody might need to thrive at work. So where a reasonable adjustment, it goes beyond what a reasonable adjustment could provide, essentially. That's the easiest way to remember it. So it means that you could get support for a disability or health condition, which includes ADHD, being autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, Tourette's, many, many more, pretty much all of the ones we've mentioned on the slide previously. And it's used to pay for things that wouldn't be considered a reasonable adjustment. So, for example, it also depends on the costs of the business or the costs that a business can afford as to how much Access to Work can contribute. You don't have to pay the grant back, and it can be used to cover adjustments that go beyond what your employer is expected to provide. And there is a capped fund, I believe, of £62,000 per applicant at the moment for an Access to Work grant. So in terms of practical support, this can support you with day-to-day working. So this could look like specialist equipment or assistive software. I work with a client who uses something called, I think it's called TalkTalk or Talk Type. And that is something that dictates what people have said. So they'll record people and it types it out for them. Physical changes to your workplace, so it could pay for things like ergonomic chairs, a sit-stand desk, something that I've managed to get through Access to Work, actually. Noise cancelling headphones, if they're very expensive ones. These are really brilliant. I think they're the Bose Quiet Comfort ones. Support workers as well. It can pay for support workers, such as a job coach, a travel buddy, or a British Sign Language interpreter. Adaptations to a vehicle or help with the cost of commuting if public transport isn't accessible. So an example I use, so he was really anxious travelling on public transport. So he was able to apply for Access to Work due to that anxiety around being autistic and using public transport. And they funded Uber taxis for him to get to work, so that removed that barrier for him. Oh, tips to apply. So this is an important one. Apply early if you can, because the current wait time, I believe, and I'm sure that Lucy's on the call and will let me know, but it's about 24 weeks from when you put your application in to having your application reviewed and put through by Access to Work. There are some, ideally, you want to apply for it when you are about to start a job, because Access to Work will fast track your application for you. I think the quickest turnaround we've seen has been, I think, 3 days from when that person put their application in to having their grant awarded and support there. So if you are about to start a new job, I believe within 6 weeks, you can have your application fast tracked. It's not just for full-time jobs, and it's not just for people who are employed by an employer. It's also applicable to part-time roles, paid internships, apprenticeships, and self-employment as well. So freelancers. You can ask somebody to help you apply. So it's okay to get support from a coach, a personal assistant, a friend, or support worker. You might be asked to supply some medical information. So a GP letter, a diagnosis report, or a brief explanation of your needs is usually enough. You have to type it all into the government application form. And you'll need to collect quotes. So for coaching, for software, equipment, or other support that you're requesting. So when we say quotes, I mean you need to reach out to a provider who can give you the support that you're looking for. I need £350 to pay for a pair of really good headphones. I'm just thinking of the ones I've applied for, £600 for an electric desk, that kind of thing. So in summary, let's recap our key points. You don't have to go through this alone. Support is available to help you apply wherever you are. Access to Work is designed to reduce barriers, not to fix your brain. It's there to help, not hinder, and it's not there to put you in a box or force a square peg into a round hole. You have the right to support. Neurodivergence isn't a protected characteristic, but it could fall under disability under the Equality Act 2010. And that means that that protection is there for the employer and you as well. Plan early. I know this is a difficult one for especially ADHDers. I don't know if anybody is neurodivergent, not asking everyone to overshare, but it is really tricky for us to plan. So if that is something you struggle with, lean on somebody that you trust to help you, whether that be a manager, whether that be a support worker, whether that be a significant other. So I'm very lucky that I have that support, but have that plan in place to get that support that you need, essentially. And use the grant to show your strengths. It's also about giving you the tools and confidence to do your best work. So when you are applying for access to work, talk about your strengths and what you can bring and how it will help you. I think that's the key thing, overcoming the barrier and enabling you to do the best that you can possibly do. That's a really strong thing to put on an access to work application. And actually, I think we've seen really positive results from that when we've supported people applying as well. So this is for managers and HR line managers. If anybody is interested, we have a free webinar about access to work, and it's called A Manager's Guide to Access to Work. So it explains the process from an employer's side, what support is available and how to help team members get the most out of it. The QR code is on the screen and there is a link below as well. We can send that out after the presentation today as well. So if anybody wants us to follow up with any of the links from today's presentation at all, just let us know afterwards. And I believe that is it. Thank you all so much for coming along today. It's been a pleasure. If anyone has any questions they would like to follow up with, we've got 15 minutes for a Q&A session that will be starting in about a minute, I reckon. But if you would like to follow up after you've had some time to process and you want to speak to somebody on a one-to-one basis, you're more than welcome to drop us an email at inquiries@inclusivechange.co.uk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Becca. We have had a couple of questions in the chat, but one of the questions is many people in the neurodivergent affirming online communities disagree with people saying that everyone is on the spectrum. What are your thoughts?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would also disagree. And the reason for that is not to invalidate anybody's experience. As I said, we are all welcome to say and do the wrong thing in the interest of learning, right? But historically, everybody is on the spectrum has been used, that phrase itself has been used as a phrase of, it's been used as a way of kind of denying access to people who might need it, who might not be as openly neurodivergent or easy to clock as neurodivergent as other people. I think specifically the autistic community. And the truth is, as I said, everybody has a brain that works differently. I personally think that everybody out there, I don't actually think there's anything or any such thing as a neurotypical brain, but the point is that actually people who are autistic, for example, they will experience life in a very different way to somebody who's neurotypical. So to say that everybody is on the spectrum diminishes the struggles that that person might have experienced. And it also disregards any barriers that they might come up against, like they might go selective mute and not be able to speak to people. They might come up against, I'm thinking of like specific ones that I've worked with or clients that I've worked with who've experienced barriers, but they might not be able to process communication in a particular way. So the point being is actually I do see where they're coming from, because I know that it probably comes from a good place of, well, like everyone's different, which is great, but actually it disregards the barriers that people who are neurodivergent do experience. And actually, if it's not affecting their life to the point that they, haven't got a disability, they shouldn't really be saying that. But, like if they're not somebody who's regarded as having a disability, actually that can be really hard for that person who is neurodivergent, autistic, ADHD, who reads that and goes, oh, actually, does that make sense?
Okay.
Hopefully that was helpful.
Yep. Thank you very much, Becca. And a further question is, when we're talking about reasonable adjustments, what if you encounter barriers with getting the adjustments put?
Yes, so this is a really good question. Now, you are entitled to make adjustment requests under the Equality Act if that person, it's never a person, if that organisation pushes back, then actually I think there could, well, it's probably worth asking Lucy for her experience because she's got the more relevant tribunal cases. But actually, I think that would be regarded, it could be regarded as breaking the law. Is that right? Potentially, Lucy? I don't know if you wanted to come in and help at all, but I think that if an
It's
employer
very yeah, it's a very personal and case by case question. So quite often it might be about encouraging or finding support to advocate with you, because if you're in an organization perhaps and you will have a union, it's about talking to your union. It might be about maybe talking to another line manager or finding somebody who can support you to advocate for your request. But it is very much a case by case situation. And if something isn't agreed or you're refused, it would be very helpful to say, and why is that? Can you tell me why? Because then you have it documented, and so does the organization. So everybody needs to think about this from a balanced point of view. But I'd certainly say if you can find somebody to help you advocate, that would be really very, very helpful for you.
That's a really good tip. Thank you, Lucy. And also, I think there's something to say about psychological safety as well. You need to make sure that having an advocate there can be a really great thing, because if you're somebody who really struggles to, I'm trying to think of how I would say this, like if I was in this position, but so I really struggle to advocate for myself. Having somebody do it for me, if I've written it down and said, I'd like you to say this, please, is actually really helpful, and it removes that barrier. So yeah, I'd agree with Lucy about the advocacy, and it gives you that psychological safety as well. You don't have to stress about going into a meeting. What if I say the wrong thing? These are all things that I have thought of personally. I'm not saying you do, but yeah, I hope that's helpful. And thank you for the question as well. It's a great question. Any more, Carly?
No more questions in the chat unless anyone wishes to ask them now.
Hi. Can I ask something? Hello.
Of course you can.
Thank you. I missed a bit at the beginning about the career coaching, and you said it was on a slide. Are you going to send us the slides?
We can do, yeah. I'm pretty sure we can, can't we, Carly? There's nothing on there that's.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll send them afterwards.
Yeah. Thank you. That would be really useful. And another question. I'm sorry I missed. I was trying to keep up. If we need an advocate, how do we find one?
Really good question. So it's up to you who you choose to go along with you. It could be a union. It depends on the organisation as well, if it's a business perspective. But if you have a support worker, you could ask them to come with you. If it's a colleague that you trust, you could ask them to come with you as well. At Inclusive Change, as support workers, we've often gone along for our neurodivergent clients and been their advocates for them in, should I say, situations like meetings and things where they might not be able to verbalize what they want to say. So that could be an option. Are there any more that I've missed off? Lucy, sorry to keep calling on you. I realise that you've got your camera off, but have I covered
places
everyone
like
there?
ACAS. So taking a look at places like ACAS, ACAS, they have some advice. We can support, but I will openly say that we have to do that through a commercial agreement. So we would need to charge for that service. There are places you can look at things like Citizens Advice Bureau, but one of the things I will say is that having people who can fight your corner, even from a union perspective, who have also got a good understanding of neurodiversity in the workplace, and where neurodivergent conditions in particular can cause barriers, finding somebody with that level of experience and knowledge can sometimes be quite difficult. One of the key things that we do, for instance, might be something like a work-based assessment, where we could come in, we work with an individual, plus we would work with the employer and line managers to look at a job, a role profile, and then get an understanding of how an individual might be coping in that role, where there are barriers because of neurodivergence. And then we produce a report that says, hey, these are the things that we would recommend. These are the things that are reasonable adjustments. And here's what we would say you should be asking for in terms of access to work support, for instance. So that's a really good start, but it involves everybody to look at that. And quite often we need to have an employer on board to make that successful, because otherwise it becomes conflict between one or another.
Just to circle back as well, I would also say that charities and grassroots organisations are a good place to look. So I know specifically the ADHD Foundation has been quite good. The ADHD UK as well, I think that's what they're called, the one with like the big purple banner. Sam Thompson's actually an ambassador for them. I think I put him on the slideshow earlier. I'm pretty sure I did. But then the National Autistic Society, the Dyslexia Foundation, all of those places would be a good place to reach out for sort of advice and mutual support around advocacy as well, if that's any help.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions? Did anybody else have anything they wanted to ask? It's absolutely fine if not. If you want to take some time away and process, I do understand what that's like, so it's no problem. But if anyone has got any more questions, I'm more than happy to answer them for
you. For the not reasonable adjustments, for the access to work fund, is there a coherent list of items that you could request that have been authorised in the past that we can access?
That's a really good question. So I'm going to answer that ever so slightly on a tangent, Jo, just because the access to work process is a bit, what's the word that I would describe it as? It can be a little bit complex for, like, if you're not familiar with it. If you are new to the process, and if you're somebody who's not 100% sure what you need in terms of support, I would recommend going down the assessment route. So what Access to Work will do, once you put your application in, is they'll review it and then they'll organise a phone call with you once that sort of wait period is over. As I said in the presentation, depending on how soon you are due to start work or if you're already in work, that can vary massively. So if you're about to start a brand new job within 6 weeks, like I said earlier, like Lucy and I have seen an application turn around in 3 days, but more recently it's probably about sort of the 1 week, 2 week mark. And they will ask you what sort of things you might need. And you can talk about your neurodiversity if you want to, or talk about the barriers that you experience. And what they'll often do is recommend you go for a workplace assessment. So that's either through Maximus or somebody else, a secondhand provider they do. But that assessment is an hour long and they go through all of the difficulties that you currently have at work and they recommend things for you. So if that is something you're not too sure of, you can do it that way. You can also go, if you know exactly what support you need and you know what equipment you want to ask for, you can ask for that upfront on your application as well. So it's completely dependent on if you know exactly what you need or if you think that you might benefit from a workplace assessment. Does that make sense in terms of what to do?
It does. It just I am literally going to be starting a new job in September, and having even before kids, I'd never had any support with my dyslexia, but I've also now been diagnosed ADHD, which means I know I can get more support. So I now am aware of what I can gain access to. It's a case of trying to make the transition back into work a lot easier as well.
100%. Well, first of all, well done on securing your job. And if there is anything that we can help with access to work wise, I believe that we offer support with access to work applications on a one-off fee basis. And I can send you some information off the back of our call if that'd be helpful, Jo. But if you're not too sure what support you would need, then I would recommend putting your application in, describing, I think there's a section where you can describe what disability or condition you have and how it affects you at work. And we have got a sort of like a template of how the access to work application looks as well that we could send out. And then from there, Access to Work will call you, after that sort of waiting period of either, I was going to say 3 days to 24 weeks. And then they recommend whether they would put you forward for a work-based assessment to identify what equipment could be helpful. Because the other thing I forgot to mention is the grant is actually split into 2 support categories. So you've got support worker and specialist equipment. So there's up to, I think, 62 grand available for either of those 2 things. And we actually see quite a lot of our neurodivergent clients asking for and being awarded grants for job coaches, support workers, virtual assistants, all those things that can take that executive function off. So yeah, there's a big range of support available. It's just about what would work for you, I would say, which is a bit of a vague answer. So I apologise for that. But has that been helpful?
That's helpful. Thank you.
No problem. And congratulations. Good luck in starting your new job. Thank you. You're welcome. Amazing. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? No pressure. I think we're all good. Carly, are there any more questions in the chat at all, or are we?
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Becca. You did a great job, and I'll make sure that those links get sent out to after the call.
Amazing stuff. Perfect. Well, yeah, thank you all ever so much for joining.